Hello and welcome back to another episode of FranklinCovey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. Gosh, coming up onto our 7th year with over 500 episodes taped, where every Tuesday and Friday I have the enormous privilege to sit in this studio with our amazing production team and converse with some of our generation's most remarkable people. Sometimes they come in the form of Pulitzer Prize winning authors or billionaire entrepreneurs. Often they are founders, visionaries, CEOs of remarkable companies, both public and private. Sometimes they are educators, academics, researchers, scientists. Occasionally it's a political appointee or a former ambassador or governor, or even in some cases a presidential candidate here in the U.S. FranklinCovey, of course, is known as the world's most trusted leadership firm, although based here in Salt Lake City, Utah, in the States. Of course, our footprint is global, founded in part by Dr. Stephen R. Covey, the iconic leadership expert and author of the world-renowned best-selling book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This podcast is designed to invest in you as a leader, to help you pursue your own great missions and perhaps make you even more effective. We love to interview people from all walks of life and all backgrounds, and today we're here to highlight Saad Mohseni. He is the chairman and CEO of the Moby Group and the author of the recent release, Radio Free Afghanistan, a 20-year odyssey for an independent voice in Kabul. Saad, welcome to On Leadership.
Thank you, Scott.
It's great to have you here. I was telling you off air, I read a lot of books, right? Both because I am a literary agent and an author myself. This podcast has been going on for, almost 7 years, and most of our guests have a book. And so I told you off air, it's a good sign when you open the book, when I opened your book, and all of a sudden I looked up and I was on page 56, because I got a lot going on in my life that will want to hijack my attention, but I found the book to be riveting, learned so much about Afghanistan, about your own upbringing, your passion for media and a free voice as a reporter. Found it interesting that I'm sure Americans have a lot of opinions, mixed opinions on Afghanistani culture, right? And what that's like both pre and post the U.S. occupation or liberation, or however you want to describe our political motivation. We'll talk about that a little bit in your book today. By nature, you are both perhaps an accidental entrepreneur. You share some stories about how you developed your own business skills and then kind of fell into and then thrived in this 20-year, you call it Odyssey, for an independent voice in Kabul. Let's rewind a couple of decades, because you've got a fascinating history in terms of where you were born, where you were raised, where you lived around the world, how that instructed your culture, your language. Will you just kind of reorient everyone around the world to your journey from a kid until now? And then we'll dig into some of the fascinating insights into your book, Radio Free Afghanistan.
Thank you. Well, I was born in London in 1966, son of an Afghan diplomat. My father was a career diplomat. He was born in Afghanistan. His first posting was in Washington, D.C., when Eisenhower was president. So my father, who passed away last year, was born in 1926. He had a fairly long career until the Russians invaded. And at the time, we were in Japan, Tokyo, Japan, and we decided not to go back to Afghanistan. And we became political refugees in Australia. And then I embarked on a career in finance, working as a trader and investment banker. And then at the age of 30, I had this sort of midlife crisis, having sort of in my own way succeeded in the finance sector. I thought, well, life's going to be more interesting than this. And I packed my bags and I went to Uzbekistan, Soviet Central Asia, and I was there for about 3 or 4 years. Then I went back to finance, and then 9/11 happened, and then we went to Afghanistan to check things out. And we started off with this very small radio station, and that's how it all got started.
Saad, obviously the majority of our listenership is going to be from the US, but there's a large portion from around the world. And so I can only represent that as a US citizen and someone, although I've lived outside of the US, I've spent obviously the majority of my life here. And of course, I like to think of myself as an independent thinker, but I'm obviously manipulated and conditioned by the US media. I recognize that as well. You know, in the US, I think there's probably a pervasive ideal that we went into Afghanistan post 9/11 to right the wrong that was, you know, the terrorist camps there producing terrorists, and obviously routed the Taliban, and then were there for some very long period of time, hundreds of billions of dollars of US taxpayer investment, countless Afghanistani lives lost, countless American lives lost, and then with a abrupt and unceremonious, fleeing from the country under the Biden administration, which of course was a wedge issue, one of the many wedge issues in the most recent presidential race. The Taliban, however, is different today than you might have said it was 30 years ago. I think most Americans hear Taliban and they think of the same thing. Would you maybe give a little bit of a, as least biased possible, answer to, what is the current day Taliban like versus what we know from blowing up, sacred Buddhist statues from centuries ago, pre-American invasion? What would you like the U.S. to know about life in Afghanistan today, hence the Americans have left, versus what it was post, Soviet occupation, post-U.S. invasion 20 plus years ago?
Well, the situation, as you can appreciate, is always a lot more nuanced than how it's usually portrayed in the media. The Taliban is obviously, it's not a monolithic movement. It has different members with different points of view. Some are pragmatic, some are moderate, some are very hardcore. And probably their views on issues don't differ that much to the views of the Taliban in the 1990s. So we're talking about a fairly complicated movement, political and religious movement. At the moment, the jury's still out. We're not sure what the Taliban in say 2028 will look like. But what we do know is that on the ground, depending on the city, depending on the village, depending on the town, their decrees are enforced differently. For example, women are not allowed to work for NGOs, but a lot of NGOs continue to hire women and employ women. In our organization, something like 30% of all employees are female, including journalists and television presenters. The government, including the Ministry of Interior, has female employees. When you land in Kabul, it's usually a female employee that stamps your passport. But technically, they're not allowed to go outside unaccompanied. They have to have a male family member to accompany them. But in reality, you do see women walking around the cities, major cities. They continue to drive. So there is a sort of a disconnect between, in terms of what's being decreed and what's being implemented. However, something has to give. Either they're going to enforce all their decrees 100%, or the movement will need to ease up in terms of its decrees. So we're not quite sure, and that's one of the reasons why I'm careful. I've been careful in terms of returning to the country, because we still do not fully understand the movement and which direction it's heading towards.
Saad, I have a couple of maybe political questions, and I'm going to ask them fairly naively so as not to let my own bias interfere with them. Is democracy the right form of government for every country, and particularly that of Afghanistan? There was a great debate after President George W. Bush led the invasion of Iraq, and to instill democracy in this, country that was thousands of years older than America was. I think there's been a great discussion around is the thousands of years of culture in Assyria, Iraq, and the area, does it have the fertile ground for democracy? Is the democratic form of government a viable form of government in your home country of Afghanistan? Is it the wrong solution?
Well, it just depends on what your definition of democracy is. If democracy is just about voting, and then bringing out ballot boxes every 4 years and getting people to vote, that approach may be slightly flawed. If democracy is about freedom of expression, it's about civil society, educating people, educating for all, opportunities for all. I think that would work anywhere. I think the issue in Afghanistan was that in some areas it was very underdeveloped. The education literacy rates were exceptionally low. There wasn't much civil society. Media was, very new. In 2003, 2004, when we had our first elections in late 2004, media had only been around for 12 months. So we took some baby steps. I think in some areas we succeeded, in some areas we failed. I think one of the reasons why elections failed in Afghanistan was because of the level of corruption and intimidation, and how strongmen were able to secure votes. And by the way, we saw something similar in Iraq, where it became very partisan and very sectarian. And of course, people take advantage of this. In Iraq, it was the Iranians and Iranian-backed militias and various strongmen. In Afghanistan, it was usually the warlords and others. And corruption allowed people to buy votes and to fill up ballot boxes, stuffed ballot boxes. But I think time would have rectified that. And unfortunately, in the case of Afghanistan, the world just didn't have the patience.
Saad, please take no offense to this, but I sometimes liken in my own mind Afghanistan to Haiti, because it kind of seems like almost, they can't catch a break, that they're almost doomed to destruction. I mean, they don't have a large educated population. They don't have natural resources that can allow them to provide a legal and thriving tax base. There's not a lot of foreign investment, not much tourism. What is the path forward for a thriving and free Afghanistan? Or will this be, like Haiti has suffered for generations, certainly since I've been alive? Haiti's had so many issues with corruption and assassinations and, of course, hurricanes and earthquakes. Afghanistan's had its own with invasions and corruption and the Taliban and so on. What's the path forward to a thriving Afghanistan, if there is one?
Well, Scott, people forget that Afghanistan was at peace and Afghanistan was stable until the Soviets invaded in late 1979. It had decades of stability and security. And then all of a sudden, our neighbor at that time, the Soviet Union, extended to the Afghan border, invaded the country, and it was disastrous for the Afghans. 7 million Afghans were forced to flee the country. Training camps were set up in Pakistan and Iran to train these religious fighters, backed by the Americans, backed by the Saudis, backed by the West. And then, and we're still paying the price for that. And that war was very costly for Afghans. Over 1 million killed, 1 million handicapped. It's the most mined country on the planet. Even today, there are instances of people going out for a walk and then losing a limb. So the radicalization of the country happened in that decade. Afghanistan basically fought the West's war against the Soviet Union and was instrumental. I mean, I think if you look at the reasons as to why the Soviet Union broke up, Afghanistan certainly played its role in the demise of the Soviet Empire. It was costly for them, bad publicity, bad PR for the Soviet Union. And in 1991, only 2 years after leaving Afghanistan, did the Soviet Union break up. So I think that I'm not saying that we have to blame the West or the East for our wars, but certainly didn't happen all of a sudden. There were factors contributing to it, and there were outside factors. They were not domestic internal issues. Now, how do we get Afghanistan back on track? I think education is very important. Afghanistan does have resources, according to U.S. Geological Survey conducted a number of years ago. It has over $1 trillion in resources, from lithium to natural gas to copper and so forth. And we have to find ways to exploit it. Obviously, it's landlocked, so we have to have the infrastructure, the railway networks, the roads, the airports, to be able to make the most of what we have. But you also need leaders with vision. And I think eradicating corruption should be a priority, even under the Taliban. It's an issue, that is raised on a regular basis. How to have transparency, and how to ensure that you have a governing body that's accountable to its population. So, but there are a lot of boxes that we need to tick before Afghanistan's back on track. I mean, ironically, it has been stable over the last 3 years. Obviously, people are not dying because there's no war anymore, and the relative stability and safety that our citizens enjoy allow them to travel and to do business with each other and so forth. And there's even tourism, both domestic as well as international tourism. Not in huge numbers, but we're beginning to see signs. I don't know if you recall, Scott, but in the 1970s, Afghanistan was a big destination for tourists. Hippies and ordinary tourists would travel through the region. People have wonderful memories of Afghanistan from those days.
You have lived around the world, right, as a refugee, but you also lived in Australia and Japan, the UK, in the Emirates. And so you have a very much of a world view in terms of where Afghanistan fits in the world. I think at last blush, something like less than 50% of Americans hold a valid passport. We're a large country, and you can live a really lovely life having never left the U.S. I've been privileged through my career at FranklinCovey to have been to 36 countries, not Afghanistan, of course, but certainly countries in the Middle East and Asia. What would you like to say to most Americans, or for that matter, other people listening to this podcast, watching you as a journalist, as an entrepreneur, as a fearless journalist, radio producer, about what Afghanistan is like? Because I'm guessing a pretty common view of America is, well, that was the bastion of terrorism that helped to, foment the attack on America, 20 plus years ago. And we invaded, conquered, killed, sat, and then fled overnight, abandoning, treasure and destruction and hope. And it's a big debate in the U.S. about the lives that were lost from our own troops, whether we should have or should not been there. I imagine you have your own opinions on that. What would you like our listeners to know about your country, your people, your culture? And then we'll talk a little bit about, the riveting book you've written about communication and press in Afghanistan.
Well, I think first and foremost, the jury's out as to whether the invasion or liberation of Afghanistan was a failure. I think that the 2 decades that the Americans and its international partners were in Afghanistan were transformative for the country. If you look at the data in terms of literacy rates, went through the roof, more than doubled in that 2-decade period. Life expectancy went up by 50%. Child mortality dropped significantly. The economy grew. So I think, and what's interesting today, Scott, is that even if we talked about the Taliban and how certainly in the cities, they're not as bad as we thought they would be. And it's partly because there's pushback from the local population. The Taliban are learning from ordinary citizens in terms of how to conduct themselves. And they're coming to terms with this developed, sophisticated society, relatively sophisticated society. So I think the internationals can pat themselves on the back, perhaps, although the withdrawal was clumsy and quite damaging to U.S. and international reputation. But I think they left something real behind. And I think that in 10 years and 5 years, we'll look back and say, hey, this exercise, although costly, was very effective. So I think that's really important. I think for the Americans, for the American population, and especially now with Trump in power, there's this sort of this sense that we have to focus within and we need to adopt a more isolationist policy. But I think, mistakes have been made along the way, but there have been also many successes in terms of U.S. engagement and leadership globally. And I think for America to go back to that sort of 1920s mindset and to completely shun the rest of the world is probably perhaps also not a good thing for America longer term.
Well, that was beautifully said. Let's talk about your adventure in Afghanistan. You and a very trusted, brave group of journalists set up a radio program where you constantly, daily, it's almost like reading a sitcom in some cases of the Taliban coming in and saying, you can't do this and you must do that and you have one more hour, you have one more day, and then being sort of abducted and then let go. And it's almost like a comedy sketch routine in terms of how you were testing power and fearlessly moving forward. What would you like our listeners to know about some of the adventures you and your colleagues had with bringing, entertainment on television, bringing entertainment on in any media platform, where you were told what kind of program you could and could not show? You were, honestly, by hour, you were trying to cook up programming that may or may not get you killed or get you abducted or get your family. You can't even relate to the stories in this book. It's a riveting tale of sort of media entrepreneurialism in your country. Take that wherever you'd like to go and share some stories around the bravery and struggle of you and your colleagues and maybe where it is present day.
I think, Scott, if you look at, you're obviously a sort of a reader and I suppose observer of history, and it's extraordinary how individuals can make a difference, whether it's in politics or sports or business. And I think same in our line of business in a country like Afghanistan, it is the courage and let's call it cheekiness of individuals that have allowed us to continue to not just survive, but also thrive in this new environment. Now, there are limitations in terms of what we can do, but these 20-something individuals, either because they had the news or they had the entertainment departments or the female journalists, these people have not been cowed or intimidated, and they continue to go and resist. It's extraordinary, and I can't take any credit for their courage. And I think to a large extent, your listeners and viewers should know that we usually provide our people with a lot of freedom and flexibility, and they ultimately make the tough decisions because they're on the ground. So they have to deal with a government that technically does not tolerate any sort of dissent, that's very dictatorial in its approach, that has a very narrow view of issues, including women's rights and education and so forth. And then on the other side, we have people, obviously, that represent the majority of Afghans who want to be entertained. They want to hear the news or watch a news bulletin that tells the truth. They care about accountability and transparency. They care about women's rights. They care about women's education. So we have this tug of war, and it's an ongoing tug of war, and it's been going for 3.5 years since the Taliban took power in the country.
There's so many riveting stories in this book that, someone in a first world country can't even remotely relate to. Perhaps if you served in the military, which I did not, you could. There's one particular story toward the end of the book where you talk about, and you don't demonize the Americans in this book. You don't necessarily demonize anybody. You're a journalist and you share the facts as you see them. Your staff has undergone, countless intimidation techniques and abductions and releases, culminating in, I believe it was a suicide bomber that ran into one of the buses of your employees and slaughtered many of your colleagues. And that whole story, part of the book, is just, breathtaking. You also share a story about how there was a particular American strike, of which there were very many that were successful defined however you want to, but another one that actually fell, I think it was maybe on either a wedding party or where there were 100 civilians that were killed, mainly women and children, in Herat. And you covered that as well. What happens to those people, to the extent you know, when an American military sortie or excursion gets it wrong and 100 women and children are killed by accident, in quotation marks? Do you have any knowledge of, do we pay recompense to those people? I'm guessing that incites hatred in America and ignites future terrorists? It's a broad question, but you hear about these strikes and you wonder, what happens to these survivors and the families? Not just long-term, short-term and long-term.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, to be honest with you, the Americans went into Afghanistan, certainly the individuals we dealt with, diplomats, even military officials, with good intentions. There was a great deal of goodwill in Afghanistan when it came to the Americans, and the other way around. I think most Americans, having read The Kite Runner and having watched footage of American soldiers and diplomats liberating Afghanistan, there was a great deal of goodwill, and there were many, many good opportunities. But I think the problem, and more often than not, in terms of these strikes, I don't think anyone intentionally wanted to kill, women and children at a wedding banquet. I think it was flawed intelligence, the Americans relying on individuals they shouldn't have relied on. And it was usually, because we dealt with the American communications people, it seemed to be a shock to them as it was to us. And so they were always, on 2 or 3 occasions when a lot of civilians are killed, there was almost panic in the sense that they didn't quite know how to react. So they would say, we'll launch an investigation, and then that would take a week or so, and then eventually that, come out and confess that, yes, it was us, it was a US strike, and it posed this many fatalities. And then they would go and compensate the families, I don't know, $2,000 or $3,000, which was significant, but, no matter how significant a payout is, it doesn't replace family members. So obviously there was, over time, the resentment built up. But these are things that happen in a war, and there's, we talk about fake news. I mean, people were fed information that was not right, and the Americans fought 20 different wars 1 year at a time in Afghanistan, and if they had accepted that they would be in the country for 20 years, they would have probably had a totally different strategy, and they did not. And this was the problem with the American approach in Afghanistan. I don't think anyone assumed in 2001 that they would be there for 20 years. Everyone thought they would be out in 3 or 4 years. That's why there was no clear strategy in terms of dealing with issues like governance, policing, building the military, and so forth. And it was, the Afghan military wasn't, I think our soldiers fought well, especially in the first 18 years. But the police was corrupt. The government was corrupt. The Americans were not good at nation building. I think this is an important lesson from this experience.
This could be a 4-hour interview. Would love to have you at my house at dinner sometime if you're ever in the Mountain West, because you would be a fantastic dinner guest. You, as the leader of this radio and television, venture, you spent a lot of time with the Afghanistani political leadership, including the subsequent presidents. Americans know President Karzai, of course, because of his Western dress and his sort of fashion sense, and would come over and court Congress and the presidents over here for funding and such. President Karzai was well known to most Americans. I think he even appeared at a State of the Union address at one point, primetime television. He was a very a very skilled politician, at least as it came to courting American opinion and support for our work there. Did you find that the subsequent presidents, Karzai and the one that followed him, were ethical people? You actually are fairly complimentary in terms of some of your engagements you had with them. At one point, he tells you, fix your radio station, and you say, fix your cabinet, fix your government, and you kind of smiled. Should the Americans believe that the Afghanistani presidents were honest, well-intended leaders of their country? Were they also corrupt? It's a broad statement. Answer it however you like.
Well, I think personally, this is an opinion, but my personal opinion is that Karzai, as president, was not corrupt. He continues to live in Afghanistan in a house provided by the state. People, the members of the business community help him out in terms of his monthly expenses. He doesn't have a villa in the south of France. He doesn't have a yacht. He doesn't have any of those things. However, he tolerated corrupt individuals. And I have it in my book that, we had evidence in regards to certain ministers who'd been lining their pockets. And Karzai was, he said, well, good, let them steal. Everyone else is stealing. And I just thought that was, for me, heartbreaking to hear that a president of a country would have that sort of blasé attitude when it came to corruption, especially members of his own cabinet. But he felt that his hands were tied. He thought that, there's too much money. If these guys are not stealing, someone else will steal. The country had been flooded with cash from the international community, and it had no capacity to absorb this much cash. And this is another lesson for us, that a country as impoverished as Afghanistan, you don't pump this much money into it. It just has no capacity to utilize that cash. So to answer your question, it's yes and no. It's that he personally was not corrupt, but he tolerated corruption, and that's just as bad. In terms of the Ghani who followed him, his cabinet members are definitely corrupt, and there are certainly allegations that he also was corrupt. And of course, stories that he, left the country with bags of cash are not, difficult to verify, but nonetheless, there have been witnesses who've confirmed that. But to look at Afghanistan today, where 2 million people, on the verge of starvation, and to think that these individuals stole so much money from the state is heartbreaking. And I think that's why I think at the end people were unwilling to fight for the government, because the government it was not a government of the people for the people. It was a corrupt government, completely disconnected from the rest of the population.
Your book is riveting. I learned a lot about American interventionism and the culture of Afghanistani people. I loved the story of you talking how you moved to Uzbekistan because you couldn't enter the country, but it was the most proximate. It was the most familiar in terms of the flora and the fauna and the food, and how you desperately tried to get information out. And it's heartbreaking in many areas. And you and your team are heroes for what you did to provide information and news, and also sort of keep eye on those who were corrupt. Saad Mohseni, your book is Radio Free Afghanistan, a 20-year odyssey for an independent voice in Kabul. Best of success to you and your family and safety. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'll come and see you in Utah.
Open invitation, my friend. And we'll see you back here next week on Leadership.